30th of June 927, Beric looking out over the flat lands of the once kingdom of Godidine Osrith surprised to see an army crossing the flatlands south of the Two-Eyed, a small army, coming from the north. Osrith turned to Bean from the hillock beside the Hall's farm and asked the boy to tell Coltigar that the next change of warriors was about to arrive, although, she thought, it seemed a little early in the month, and more warriors than usual. She had been back from a week before Finan had come to her, and had organized the midsummer feasting and celebrations, which went on until the morning. It had been then when she had seen a rider, white-horsed, coming towards Beric's Hall farm, slowly, and steadily, pausing at the bonfire and exchanging a few words with Mund. "With how much pleasure did Utah tell you about Queen Gwythelf?" Osrith has asked, when she waited outside her farm hall as the rider that eventually drew nearer. Finan got off his horse and walked the last few steps to her, leading the bridle. And all the words Osrith had had in her head for when he eventually did return evaporated like the dew of a morning, and she ran to him, Finan drawing her to him, and kissing her. "He told me," Finan had replied, but then he changed the subject and said, "I thought young Finan would come this way." He told her, as they sat at the kitchen table in the manor hall. "He could have come by boat, you could have missed him," Osrith told her husband. Or, perhaps, he had decided to choose to stay at Dunnottar. She had asked their son how his sword work was progressing at Bibbenberg. That he had been reluctant to say had suggested to Osrith that young Finan may have been having a hard time with his uncle. "This is true," Finan replied, and reached up to her hair. It had grown longer still, and he smiled as he stroked his hand through it. Osrith was glad he had chosen that moment to do that, for she had been about to nurse it herself with her fingers. Her headaches had been coming back intermittently since her injury at Tamworth, and she had been experiencing dull aches for the last few days, and did not want Finan to find out. So her husband returned to the farm and involved himself in its upkeep. It was nearly time for harvest, so he had been doing the rounds with Mund to the different farms to check on their preparations. And so Finan was still asleep when Osrith got up at dawn and looked over her lands with Bean, and sent him back to Coltigar, and she stayed to watch the host come nearer, her heart hammering in her chest when she saw who it was. Blue-clad, with his horse banner high, it was Constantine himself coming to pay her a visit. And she beat back the words in her head of what Domnall had told her. It could not possibly true. Anyway, in no way had Constantine shown he had ever loved her. Osrith would never have known it from how he had always treated her. Yet, they were bonded, in a way. Osrith would not be alive now without him. At least Finan was at the farm when Constantine would arrive, and she got on her horse and rode home, calling frantically to Rhea and Coltigar to make ready for the arrival of the King of Alba, and she raced upstairs, wondering what to do now. When Finan saw her, he got up, naked, and crossed to her, kissing her neck, before stopping and stepping back. Ordinarily, Osrith would have taken the opportunity with his cock and wanked him, or sucked him off, but her agitation had caught his eye and Finan asked her what was wrong. "Constantine," she told him, and gestured towards the window. The Lord of Berwick stepped towards it, to see that it was indeed the King of Alba, and he treated the incoming warriors to a full frontal, leaning nonchalantly out of their upstairs window and casually looking down. "Finan," Osrith hissed, but he had pulled her to him, and again, the warriors from Alba could not help but see their Lady Bane embraced by her husband. "King Constantine," Finan called out to him, bollock naked. "It is good that you call at our estate. Is my son with you?" He had been taking lessons at winding up people from Utah then, Osrith thought, her heart sinking, and she looked out, seeing men she knew. Engus was there, as was Tarmaz and Senzi, guards she had trained with, fought with. It was a small royal guard and Osrith was half expected to see young Finan. Selark was there, too, his only son since Ildub. His first son by Myra had died. Half expected to see to the wild flame red hair of Edra, but her adopted daughter was not Osrith, she reminded herself, and as per her marriage agreement settled between Constantine and Finan when he and Osrith had wed, she no longer supported the girl financially. Though hardly a girl, she had the life her mother, Thyra could have only dreamed about, did dream about, and had nearly had, before she had been taken after the arson attack on her father's hall, and was now married, though living back at Dunnottar. Osric sensed Constantine noticing her analyzing his company, which she was too small a war band to fight south, too large for a hunt. Besides, Beric was 100 miles from Dunnottar. The king had gone badly wrong if he had ended up at her door by accident. And yet, something in his face told her he was planning something, for his eyes were bright with an excitement Osric long knew. Considering Ethelstan's pernicious acquisition of land and fealty collecting as he headed north, she guessed it was this which had prompted the king of Alba to ride south. He sought assurances, and wanted one, most of all. "You are most welcome, to our land," Finan called, "and the Lady of Beric will be with you shortly." He stepped from the window and gave Osric a wide grin. In her turn, Osric perused Finan's naked body, did not know whether to laugh or to scold him. In the end, she grinned too, at the ludicrosity of the man who was her husband, who refused to claim Beric's title, greeting the king of Alba in the nude, and kissed him, which caused a stirring. "I will join you when I am dressed," Finan told her, though she would be with him right then, her skin on his and it was making her wet. Osric wanted so much to hold his cock, broad and long, as all of the Gales she had known had been. Finan would gasp, then, and tell her not to stop, and he would be in her hands, literally, as he gave into his coming orgasm. Sometimes Osric liked to masturbate him, and nothing else, just to give her husband pleasure. Finan seemed to know her desires and took a step away from her, though the end of his cock was indeed glimmering with precum that made Osric know he too desired what she had in mind. "Make a start with the conversation," he told her, "find out what he wants without me being there, he will be more honest, then." Osric nodded, for she had thought the same thing too, and she hurried out of their bedchamber and down the stairs, pausing halfway down with her hand to her temples, the headache that had been threatening to give her pain hammering hard in her head, and she made herself walk sedately down the last few steps and out to the front of the hall, where Alba's finest were waiting for her. "Osric!" exclaimed a voice, and Osric turned to see that Eswi was with them. He got down from his horse and crossed to her, taking her hand and shaking it. "We are here to see how your harvest preparations are doing," he added. Later, much later, when Alba's king and the warriors, exchanged, had left Beric, Osric knew exactly what they had come for, and that a plan had been consolidated after she had left Men and come back home. Cadwallon, the ancient warlord from St. Oswald's time, had wanted to reclaim Logra, and sided with Eanfrith, Oswald's older brother and Ethelfrith's first son, whose mother had been a Pict, an ancestor of Constantine too. He had a plan, Osric mused, later, devised with the leaders of the Cymric nations and with the Norse, Unman, a plan to reclaim Britain, as a Briton might know it. And Beric would be at the center of the plan, giving access south, to the wall, and safe harbors to those vessels heading down the coast. But Osric did not know it yet, nor did suspect. As she welcomed the warriors, many of whom had lodged at the farm before and knew the drill, and were waiting patiently for what came first, which was when Osric bade Rhea to cook a meal for the all. "You are well, madam." Constantine looked at her face as she invited him indoors to eat food at her table. His expression was stiff, fixed. So many years ago he would have taken in the whole of her body, but his gaze shifted no lower than neck height. He was at least as pious as Ethelstan, now, and was taking regular instruction at Culde's. "I am indeed, your grace." She stood aside and opened wide her arm, directing him into the cool in the hall, against the growing heat of another hot summer's day. The summer had indeed been hot, but tiles reclaimed from a Roman villa, plain, red-brown, covered the floor. It meant the harvest stored above kept drier in the winter. Now, a large table sat at the center, the tithe sticks from the spring rents in bundles. It had been a good year, and Osric's farmers had been able to keep an abundance of crop, and had not been ravaged for many years. Ethelstan again, Osric thought. As with her ancestor, King Edwin of Dyria, Northumbria was enjoying peace. And, while she had not set up drinking cups by every river, Beric Sir's women with newborns could cross the country unharassed. A difficult truth to bear, considering where her own loyalty lay. Edra is well, and is enjoying being a married woman, Constantine told her. She is making her plans to live on Man permanently. When Anlaf has reinstated Guthfrith as king in Norfolk, I am glad she is happy, Osrith told him. For Constantine always had indulged his adopted daughter, and she reckoned it had been his suggestion that had helped Edra see she would be better off in her old home while her husband was out raiding and drying, even if most of the land that the Norse were doing that in were, technically, according to the documents Edra had herself located in Kuldi's monastery and shown to Osrith, his own lands. She wondered whether, at the meeting at the Tinwald, on Man, that this detail had been kept from King Owain and Prince Sindlan, who would, of course, claim them to be Henoled or Strathclyde land. Come, she called to the men, as they made their way into the farm's larger hall, and in trooped the warriors, a couple of dozen. Osrith's heart leapt in her chest, as one, glancing at her hip, met her face with a grin. Yes, she still had Bué, hard won so many years ago at Team Reach, Tara, and Domhnall MacDuan Tilda copyright ill, still had need to serve the King of Alba. It was all Osrith could do to stop herself from leaping on her old friend and pulling him close to her. But, she was the lady of this land, and he was, clearly, still in exile in Constantine's service. Osrith did, however, unsuccessfully stifle a giggle at Domhnall's appearance, so that he was indeed, with silver strands in his long, black hair and moustache. It had been dark on Man when they had last talked, and she was surprised at his age. Osrith supposed she was old, too, and laughed aloud when she thought of two old warriors standing beside one another, who had once been so close. Beside him, a young man now, looked quizzically at her. Selach was Edra's oldest friend, 8 years her junior. He would trail after her, when he was old enough to, and she would indulge him with games and consolations, with praise and attention, and the boy had thrived on her affection, and Osrith had wondered that Constantine had not married him off to Edra. Except, he knew he had a plan, and that plan had involved an invitation to Anlaf and his men to spend time at Dunnottar. An army was being built, almost exactly like the army Osrith imagined would be needed in an Alba, Strathclyde, Cymric alliance. She smiled back at the young man, and he nodded his head to her. Constantine chose to eat with the men, so Osrith led him to the large hall where Caltigar was already moving around furniture enough for the men to sit around. Usually, tithes were counted there, and Caltigar and Bean had moved several planks of wood around for them to sit in. Don't you feel upset? She said to Domhnall, as the king went to sit beside his son, that Constantine has taken on an ally such as Anlaf. Domhnall grinned at her and clapped her on the shoulder, which led to him bringing her closer to him. This is the first time I think I have ever heard you not defend my cousin, he told her, and he put his head against hers for a moment, as he used to do when they were younger, and he spoke close to her ear. And number not allying with Anlaf would not bring back my kin. It shows how he needs allies for the defense of the northern realms. Your idea, he added. Mine? Osrith exclaimed, stepping back from her friend and staring at him. You told him, in Monday. The idea was universally ratified, Domhnall told her, as Osrith's heart sank. Make show of deference while using the time to mobilize. He broke off and looked to the doorway. Osrith turned too, and saw it was Finan, who was striding over to Osrith. Good to see you found your clothes, Lord, Domhnall said to Finan, with affected deference. The lady will wish to speak to the king, Finan replied coolly, giving Domhnall his customary glower of hatred. The parlour is suitable, he added, glancing to Osrith. If you need me, I will continue with Mund, overseeing the farms. And with that, the Lord of Berwick left Osrith with the commander of Constantine's fleet, not pausing at all until he had got to his horse, waiting for the caretaker of Berwick's land. And Osrith told herself again that she was so very glad she had passed on land to Edra, as was the Brehon law custom where property passed from mother to daughter, Things were bad enough between Alba and Beric and Bibbenberg and Inglaland already. And through the shared culture of Anlaf and Edra's marriage union, the undisputed Norse leader of the Irish and King of Men would not come cheap. Constantine wanted no less than the invasion of the lands to the wall, which was precisely where Aethelstan's armies now were, though Osrith suspected that, come autumn, Edward's son would be marching his way north soon, and there would be only one place he would be going. For her brother would not give away his land, nor his service cheaply. Constantine had come to solidify his claim, and had come to Osrith for intelligence and for allegiance. His allegiance to God did not, as it did not for Aethelstan, finish at war. Rather, it began with war, to acquire land, and the hand of the saints would be on his shoulder as Saint Comsil, Oswald and Cuthbert would be on Constantine's. God was on his side. And yet God was on Aethelstan's side too. You have had a long journey, please sit, Osrith said to the king, as Domhnall watched her play hostess. And they ate the mean food that was all anyone had to spare at this time of the year, before the harvest, of bread and smoked fish. As Rhea and Bean brought the food, Constantine urged her to sit by him. I wish to talk of your allegiance, Constantine told her plainly, after they had eaten. To Selark. But, put your claim to me first, Osrith. Claim? Osrith asked as they walked outside in the strengthening sunlight. For if Constantine pulled it off, it meant most of Northumbria gone to Alba. If he didn't, it went to Aethelstan. There was a third way, Osrith knew, but it was insignificant to the hardening of borders, and the third plan would be inconsequential. Tell me, before I answer, Osrith said to him, hoping not to come back to the subject of land claims and allegiances. What of Ofoik? Eanfrith governs there, does he not? Constantine nodded, and turned his head, spitting at the name. Aethelstan's puppet, Constantine scorned. The bishop is against him. Of course, Osrith agreed, silently. Bishop Wulfstan unfailingly supported the Norse, for he unfailingly believed in Northumbrian autonomy. There's Bibbenberg, of course, Osrith suggested, but I do not suggest you go there yourself, your grace, for my brother is likely to kill you. That would indeed suit Aethelstan's cause. You think he has pledged to Aethelstan? Constantine asked her. Osrith held his gaze. I could not say for sure, but I can say that Uther desires an independent Northumbria, and he could put his own claim in with Danish help. He could very well go to Ofoik and support Guthfrith himself, but he is Sigtrygg's brother, and my brother believes he governed the land poorly when he was king. She smiled at Constantine. He wishes to stay in Bibbenberg and tend his lands. He is old. We are all old, Constantine replied. And I can see that you wish to tend Beric. He stepped to her, and Osrith thought for a moment that he was about to embrace her, but instead, the king of Alba spoke near her ear. I cannot ignore Aethelstan. My men must raid south, and it was a very shrewd thing you did giving Edra your mother's land. Osrith could only smile. She had never planned to, but the plan seemed to lie open before her, under the circumstances of her adopted daughter about to get wed to the king of the island the Cymric called Ellen Vanin. It made sense, and had meant, too, that she was not compromised. She had neither favored the northern Cymric, nor Owain, nor Constantine, nor the Norse, nor had she denied them and allied with Aethelstan. If I were you, I would send a ship, send Domhnall to see him. Now he has seen Guthfrith. He put his hand across the table. Osrith moved hers, and their fingers touched, lightly. How different might it have been if she had remained in Alba, then? If she had been the Gale he had wanted. It was a shrewd move bringing Edra to Man, she said to Constantine, moving her hands away as Caldegar brought boiled water for Osrith. Indeed, he told her. Yes, whatever makes her happy. She is no longer a child, Constantine. You have been more of a parent than I have. You are her mother, and you always have been, he told her. You fed that child from your own breast to keep her alive. You brought her to Domhnall, with the only wish that she was to be safe. I am not her mother and do not pay for her upkeep. And I was never there when she needed me. Osrith's voice sounded stiff, and she knew it. She looked up to Constantine, the regret of all the years around her. Is she happy, Constantine? Does Anlaf make her happy? So very happy, he replied, smiling. He was always a keener father with Edera than his own daughters, who had been married off to Mormas so perfunctorily that Constantine sometimes mistook which of the two girls was married to whom. And Constantine was Edera's only parent for such a long time, so much so that even when Osrith had been in Dunnottar, Edera looked to Constantine, not Osrith, for guidance. And Aethelestan? How was he when you saw him in Gloucester? Busy ruling his new kingdom of England, she told him. Hearing disputed, giving decrees. Osrith's eyes searched Constantine's face. Calling himself Rex Totlus Britanniae, king over the whole of Britain, Constantine mused. And you would still have me unite the North? Osrith nodded her head. Then I will do it, he told her. My thoughts have long rested in this direction. Beric will be behind you. Osrith told him, I cannot ask you to do this. His words told Osrith's ears, but he could not disguise a smile. But I can choose. She inhaled deeply. I do choose, Constantine. And he took her hands again, hers between his, as if in prayer. And once you have chosen, it will come, war, between the peoples of this land before the Saxons and Angles and Jutes, when there were just Britons. Lamgwin, Osrith said softly. Constantine looked up. The poet Nennius said it meant white blade, but I think it was white hand, sainted hand. You do know your family history, Constantine told her. Sainted hand, he repeated. One which is currently buried in Gloucester, with Aethelestan. He was right. Oswald's hand, along with what was reputed to be the rest of his incorrupt body, was buried there. Osrith had prayed over it, and then the North Cymric, with Prince Sindlan, came to declare her to be their queen. You know he chose Combesil's church, Osrith said, softly, and knew she had chosen her side. And she wrestled with the idea in her mind as Constantine told her that his men were going south, to besiege on Ofoik with the Norse, to try to win it back, seeking rebels to Aethelestan's cause and generally causing as much trouble as they could. But I like your idea about Domhnall, Constantine told her. If your brother is, as you say, determined to keep in Northumbria independent, he might like to hear what I have to say. 88,888,888. It had taken a lot of willpower to let them leave. She would have them longer, except that Constantine was to follow the wall to Cumberland. Guthard was long dead, and the kingdom was being held by local, petty lords and Norse settlers from Irian. She was too close to saddling her horse to ride after them, to beg Domhnall to join his banner, the ancient red right-hand symbol now closed around a cross, even though Finan was on their estate, even though her land was at peace. Whatever happened, she just did not want change, all of her life to this point, and now the battle was to be polarized, the say or the non-say, for that was what if came to. Was she say, as Oswald had been, Ethelfrith, his father, the Twister, they had called him, right back to Ida? Or was she of the Henno led through Urianovst, of the ancient Britons, as her mother had been? When they had departed, Osrith sat at the farm's table, head in her hands. She did not want war. She did not want the Mersons and West Saxons she knew to be standing opposite the Alba warriors and Cymric and Strathclydians she knew. When she heard the door at the back of the hall click open and heard Coltigar speak to Finan, it was all Osrith could do to stop herself running to her arms. So she had let him come in, and eat foot, and wait until he asked her how she was, until Osrith confessed that she felt terrible. Now it was afterwards, and they were lying in bed, his arms around her, and tonight Osrith did not want him to ever let her go. Did he come here to speak to you, Osrith? Finan asked her, and moved away from her a little, to look at her face. I asked him to, Osrith replied. You asked Constantine to come here? Finan clarified, and there was a coolness between them. You know he is on the way south, to Ofoik, for a battle? He asked her. Whatever would happen if Aethelestan heard you had harbored him? What has Aethelestan got to do with this? These are Alba lands. They have been held by Constantine's mother's family since anyone has ever known. But Finan was getting out of bed, his body rigid as stalked over their bedroom floor. Then, he turned sharply and rounded on her. I want you away from here, Finan told Osrith, severely. She sat up, and looked at him, aghast. "Why?" "Because I am not a farmer. I do not deserve land." "Osrith," he exclaimed. "Because I need to be locked away at Bibbenberg while you and Utad have all the glory on the battlefield. I saw the way you were with the ass-shit king of Alba, and the Uineel bastard." Finan shouted. "What have you agreed?" "They are my family." She told him, "They are all I had for the longest time." Osrith looked at Finan and got out of bed, standing naked before his own nakedness, and she yelped with shock as he grabbed her shoulders. "I am your family," he told her, shaking her. "I came for you, and we wed." Osrith shrugged from his grasp. "You came to Alba and accepted this land when you married me, but now, you are between one king and another," Finan declared, shaking his outstretched hand to her, "and I want you safe, Osrith. I want you alive, and God knows, I want you with me." Osrith turned, her anger thoughtless. "Then, next time Utad rides out, take me with you," she demanded. It was a ridiculous thing, and Finan hesitated, as the rational part of her brain knew he would. "I cannot promise that," he told her. But Osrith hadn't finished. "Can you promise that our son can?" "He tells me he has been denied even this." It wasn't quite true. Young Finan had told her nothing. But the guess was a good one, and Finan looked away. "I asked young Finan, I want him to. I know what you want. He has to come to me of his own accord." But he did not, Osrith. "Perhaps he is too comfortable up in Alba." "Yet, Constantine did come here, and Domnall, and people who you knew." "What did you agree?" Osrith held her temper. She did not shout back, "Because Utad wants to know." She strode over to him, and told him the truth. "Nothing. I have agreed nothing." He already has enough allies on his side. If anything, his too many alliances which could splinter easily. Guthfrith, for example. Finan stared at her for a moment, and then sat down on their bed, taking her hand and pulling her down next to him. He turned her dipped head, so Osrith looked at him. "Do not go to Guthfrith," he said, his tone severe. "Please, Osrith, I'm begging you. If you do, Aethelstan will surely attack." He did not before, Osrith thought, for he would surely have heard of Osrith's promotion to Queen Gwythelth of the North Cymric, and unlikely to have heard that she had given the land and title to Edra. "I promise," Osrith told him, "that I will not go south with Constantine to support Guthfrith." She felt Finan exhale a sigh of relief, because it told her something else. Aethelstan had Utad to his side, and Osrith said so. Aethelstan offered him Wilton Sir in exchange for Bibbenberg, Finan told her. "Ethelhelm's lands?" Finan nodded. Osrith nodded, grimly. "As I expected he would, as Utad thought he would." "What would you have?" he asked her suddenly. "This," she answered. "Utad at Bibbenberg, us here. The world not making us make impossible choices." Because choices might cause her to be standing opposite Finan M8 her husband, who had a prior commitment by oath to her brother, as she had a prior commitment by oath to Constantine. "It probably won't happen, not war," Finan said. "Bergam is where the kings are summoned to make their oaths to Aethelstan." "Bergam?" Osrith asked, recalling the name. "Amont Bridge," Finan told her. "Her land, or, rather, Edra's." And Finan told her that Aethelstan had called the Cymric kings, and Owain and Constantine there in order for them to kneel and show deference to him, and that was where he would be going with Utad. "When Sihik has the balls to tell Utad about it." Finan laughed. "Balls," Osrith thought, and she moved her hand to his cock. And afterwards, after the 3 times he had humped her, to both their satisfaction, Osrith lay in her husband's arms and stroked his chest. He may kneel to Aethelstan, Osrith thought, at the place of the rivers, where it stopped, but never in his heart would Constantine accept his overlordship. Finan said nothing more. He did not command, or argue, or say that she must stay safe, and neither did Osrith declare her intentions. But they both knew she would be going to Bergam.